Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Before we dive into one of the most chilling and disturbing stories from pre-Civil War Louisiana, I need you to do me a huge favor. Hit that subscribe button right now, share this video with someone who loves dark historical tales, and drop a comment telling me what state or country you're watching from. Trust me, you're going to want to follow this series because what I'm about to tell you will haunt your thoughts for days. Now let's step back to 1841, into the suffocating heat of Louisiana's cotton fields, where two young girls were about to become the most feared figures in the entire region. My name is Zara, and this is the story my sister Morel and I never wanted to tell, but one that needs to be heard. It began on a Tuesday morning when the August heat made the air so thick you could barely breathe, and the cotton fields stretched endlessly under a merciless sun that seemed to burn everything it touched. I was 12, Morel was 10, and we had just finished our morning chores when we heard the screaming. Not the usual sounds of punishment that echoed across the plantation. This was different. This was our mama's voice, raw and desperate, cutting through the humid air like a knife through flesh. We dropped our water buckets and ran toward the main house, our bare feet slapping against the red dirt that stained everything in this godforsaken place. The other slaves watched us with eyes full of pity and fear, their faces telling us what we already knew, but refused to accept. Master Beauregard stood on his wraparound porch, his white linen suit pristine despite the heat, holding a leather whip that dripped with fresh blood. Below him, in the courtyard where the magnolia trees should have provided shade and beauty, our papa hung from thick ropes tied to the strongest branch. "This is what happens," Beauregard's voice boomed across the plantation, "when property thinks it can steal from its owner." Our mama knelt in the dirt beneath papa's swaying body, her dress torn, her back already marked with angry red welts that would scar forever. She wasn't crying anymore. The tears had been beaten out of her an hour ago. Now she just stared up at the man she had loved for 15 years, the father of her children, as his life slowly drained away. Morel grabbed my hand so tight I thought she might break my fingers, but I didn't pull away. We stood there, hidden behind the slave quarters, watching our world collapse in real time. I remember thinking that this couldn't be real, that any moment we would wake up in our small cabin and Mama would be humming while she prepared our meager breakfast. But this was real. The flies buzzing around Papa's wounds were real. The satisfied smile on Master Beauregard's face was real. The way the other white folks, his wife, his children, his guests, watched from the porch like this was entertainment, that was real too. "The boy tried to take bread for his sick children," whispered old Samuel, who had appeared beside us like a ghost. His weathered hands shook as he spoke. "Master caught him near the kitchen before dawn." I felt something cold settle in my chest, something that had nothing to do with the morning air. It was like ice forming around my heart, protecting it from ever feeling this kind of pain again. Beside me, Morel had gone completely still, her breathing so shallow I had to look twice to make sure she was alive. When they finally cut Papa down 3 hours later, Mama crawled to his body and held him until the sun set. No one tried to move her. Even Master Beauregard seemed to understand that some grief was too big to interrupt. That night, Morel and I sat with Mama in our cabin, listening to her broken whispers about how Papa had only wanted to feed us, how he had been saving scraps for weeks because we had been getting thinner and thinner. She told us about the life they had planned before they were sold to this plantation, about the dreams they had shared of freedom, of raising their children somewhere far from the cotton fields and the whips and the endless crushing heat. "Promise me," Mama said, her voice barely audible in the darkness. "Promise me you'll survive this place. Promise me you'll be smarter than your papa and me." I promised. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew I was lying. Survival wasn't enough anymore. The ice around my heart had spread to my veins, and I could feel it changing me, hardening me into something that could do more than just endure. Morel never spoke that night. She just stared at the wall where Papa used to sleep, her eyes reflecting the moonlight like a wild animal's. When I reached for her hand, her skin was cold as winter, and I realized that whatever had broken inside me had shattered completely inside her. The next morning, we buried Papa in the slave cemetery beyond the cotton fields, where wooden crosses marked the graves of hundreds who had died on this plantation. Master Beauregard didn't attend, but he sent his overseer to make sure we didn't take too long with our grieving. As we walked back to the quarters, I noticed how the other slaves looked at us differently now. There was sympathy, yes, but also something else, a recognition that we had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. We were no longer children. We were survivors of something that had killed the innocent parts of our souls. That afternoon, while Mama lay in bed staring at nothing, Mirelle spoke her first words since Papa's death. "They're going to pay," she whispered, so quietly I almost missed it. I looked at my little sister, at the way her jaw had set into a hard line that made her look years older, and I knew she was right. They were going to pay, all of them, for what they had taken from us. The ice in my chest pulsed with something that felt almost like warmth, and I realized it wasn't ice at all. It was rage, pure and cold and patient, waiting for the right moment to burn everything down. From that day forward, the other slaves began calling us the Silent Ones. We did our work without complaint, kept our heads down, and never caused trouble. But late at night, when the plantation slept, we would sit together and plan. We were 12 and 10 years old, and we had just learned that the world was a place where good people died for trying to feed their children. But we had also learned something else, that sometimes the only way to survive monsters is to become something even more dangerous. The cotton fields whispered our names in the wind, and somewhere in the darkness, our future victims slept peacefully, never knowing that their judgment day was already being planned by two little girls who had nothing left to lose. 6 years passed like a slow-burning fever, each day adding another layer to the ice that had formed around our hearts the morning Papa died. I was 18 now, Mirelle 16, and we had perfected the art of being invisible while seeing everything. Mama had lasted 2 more years after Papa's death before the grief finally claimed her. She died in her sleep one winter night, and I swear she was smiling when we found her, like she had finally found her way back to him. Master Beauregard didn't even give us time to properly mourn. We were back in the fields the next morning, picking cotton until our fingers bled. But those 6 years hadn't been wasted. While the other slaves saw us as the quiet, obedient sisters who never caused trouble, Mirelle and I had been learning. We learned which floorboards creaked in the big house, which windows were never locked, which of the white folks had secrets they would kill to protect. Most importantly, we learned about Overseer Marcus Webb. Webb was the man who had held the rope while Papa died, who had smiled while Mama screamed, who had whispered in Master Beauregard's ear that maybe the punishment should last longer, just to make sure the other slaves understood their place. He was a thin, wiry man with pale eyes and hands that were always too eager to reach for his whip. He lived in a small house at the edge of the plantation with his wife Sarah and their 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, all under the age of 10. Sarah Webb was a nervous woman who jumped at shadows and never looked the slaves directly in the eye, as if she knew that her husband's cruelty would someday come back to haunt them all. On the night we chose for our first act of justice, the air was thick with the promise of rain, and the cicadas sang so loudly they drowned out almost every other sound. It was perfect. Nature itself was providing cover for what we had to do. Mirelle and I had spent months studying the Webb family's routines. Marcus always made his final rounds at 10 o'clock, checking the slave quarters and making sure everyone was accounted for. Sarah put the children to bed at 8:30 and was usually asleep herself by 9. The house would be quiet and vulnerable by 10:15. We waited until the plantation settled into its nightly rhythm, then slipped out of our cabin like shadows. The other slaves were used to our midnight wanderings. They thought we went to Papa's grave to talk to his spirit, and we never corrected them. Let them think we were grieving daughters instead of what we really were, predators stalking our prey. The Webb house sat about a quarter-mile from the main plantation buildings, surrounded by pecan trees that cast long, dark shadows across the yard. We approached from the back, where Sarah's vegetable garden provided additional cover, and tested the kitchen door that we knew Marcus never bothered to lock. Inside, the house smelled like cornbread and fear. We could hear Marcus snoring in the front bedroom, a deep, rumbling sound that made my skin crawl. Sarah's breathing was lighter, more restless, as if even in sleep she couldn't find peace. Morel moved toward the children's room while I headed for the master bedroom. We had planned this moment for so long that we moved without hesitation, our bare feet silent on the wooden floors. I found Marcus first, sprawled across the bed like he owned the world, his mouth open and his breath reeking of whiskey. Sarah lay curled on her side, as far from her husband as the bed would allow, her face peaceful in a way it never was during the day. For a moment, I hesitated. Sarah had never directly hurt us. She was just a woman trapped in a life she probably never chose, married to a monster because that was what her father had arranged. But then I remembered Mama's screams, Papa's broken body, and the ice in my chest pulsed with cold fire. I pressed the pillow over Sarah's face first, holding it down until her struggles stopped and her body went limp. She never even woke up enough to see who was killing her. Marcus was next, and he did wake up, his pale eyes going wide with terror when he saw my face in the moonlight streaming through the window. "You," he whispered, and I could see the recognition dawning. "You're Samuel's girl." "Oh, I'm nobody's girl," I replied, pressing the knife we had stolen from the kitchen against his throat. "I'm your judgment." He tried to fight, tried to scream, but 6 years of fieldwork had made me stronger than he expected, and the rage that had been building inside me gave me the strength of 10 men. When it was over, his blood soaked into the mattress where he had dreamed of tomorrow's cruelties. Morel appeared in the doorway, her dress stained with small handprints that would never wash clean. Her face was calm, almost serene, like she had finally found the piece that had been stolen from us so long ago. "It's done," she said simply. We arranged the bodies carefully, making it look like a robbery gone wrong. We took some jewelry, scattered some furniture, broke a window from the inside. But we also left our mark. A small symbol carved into the wooden headboard, 2 interlocking circles that represented the bond between sisters that even death couldn't break. By dawn, we were back in our cabin, lying in our beds like we had never left. When the screaming started an hour later and the other slaves came running to tell us about the terrible tragedy at the Webb house, we played our parts perfectly. "Oh no," I gasped, covering my mouth with my hands. Who could have done such a thing? Morel just stared at the floor and said nothing, which was exactly what everyone expected from the quiet sister who rarely spoke. Master Beauregard called in the sheriff, who poked around the house for a few hours and declared it the work of runaway slaves, or maybe bandits from the swamp. No one suspected the 2 grieving sisters who had been model slaves for 6 years. But that night, as we lay in our beds listening to the other slaves whisper about the murders, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Papa died: satisfaction. It was warm and sweet and addictive, like honey on fresh bread. Morel reached across the space between our beds and took my hand. "Who's next?" she whispered. I squeezed her fingers and smiled in the darkness. We had tasted blood, and we were hungry for more. The Webb family was just the beginning. There were 3 more families on our list, 3 more sets of people who had participated in Papa's death or Mama's suffering, and we had all the time in the world to plan their endings. The cotton fields whispered our secret to the wind, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the Louisiana sky like applause. The discovery of the Webb family's bodies had sent shockwaves through the entire parish, but by the third week, life on the plantation had settled back into its familiar rhythm of cruelty and endurance. Master Beauregard hired a new overseer, a brutal man named Thomas Crenshaw, who made Marcus Webb look like a saint, and the cotton harvest continued under the merciless August sun. But Morel and I were just getting started. Our second target was the Hartwell family, who owned the neighboring plantation and had been present the day Papa died, laughing and drinking mint juleps while they watched him swing from the magnolia tree. Jonathan Hartwell was a fat, sweaty man who treated his slaves like livestock, and his wife Margaret was known throughout the parish for her creative punishments. The Hartwells had two teenage sons who were already showing signs of their parents' cruelty, and a daughter who collected the ears of runaway slaves like other girls collected pressed flowers. They lived in a grand mansion with white columns and sprawling gardens, surrounded by hundreds of acres of cotton that stretched to the horizon. We spent weeks studying their routines, learning their habits, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Unlike the Webb house, the Hartwell mansion was heavily guarded, with dogs and armed men patrolling the grounds. But every fortress has its weaknesses, and we were patient enough to find them. The opportunity came during the harvest festival, when the Hartwells threw their annual party for the neighboring plantation owners. The house would be full of guests, the guards would be distracted by the festivities, and everyone would be too drunk on bourbon and self-congratulation to notice two slave girls moving through the shadows. We struck at midnight, when the party was at its peak, and the sound of laughter and music covered any noise we might make. The kitchen staff was too busy serving the guests to notice us slipping through the servants' entrance, and the hallways were dimly lit with oil lamps that created perfect hiding spots. We found Jonathan Hartwell first, passed out in his study with a glass of whiskey still clutched in his fat fingers. He never woke up. Morel's knife found his heart before his brain could register the danger. Margaret was harder to reach, surrounded by her lady friends in the parlor, but we waited until she excused herself to powder her nose. The upstairs bathroom was isolated, soundproofed by thick walls and heavy curtains. Margaret Hartwell died looking into my eyes, seeing her own reflection in the blade that ended her life. Her last words were a whispered prayer to a God who had never answered the prayers of the people she had tortured. The children were the hardest part. Not because I felt mercy, the ice in my chest had long since frozen any capacity for that, but because they were scattered throughout the house, mingling with the party guests. We had to be creative, patient, surgical in our approach. Young Robert Hartwell, the eldest son, met his end in the garden maze where he had taken a slave girl to assault her. He thought he was being clever, using the party as cover for his violence, but he had chosen the wrong night to indulge his appetites. Morel found him there and made sure he would never hurt another woman. The daughter, Elizabeth, died in her bedroom while trying on jewelry stolen from dead slaves. She had been admiring a necklace that had belonged to our mama, and the irony was too perfect to ignore. I let her see the necklace one last time before I sent her to join her parents. The youngest son, barely 14, was the last to die. We found him in the library, hiding from the party and reading books about ancient Rome. He looked up when we entered, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of myself at his age. A kind of desperate intelligence, a hunger for something beyond the cruelty that surrounded him. But then I remembered the way he had laughed when Papa died, the way he had clapped his hands like it was a circus performance, and the moment of hesitation passed. Some sins are inherited, and some cycles can only be broken with blood. When it was over, we arranged the bodies in the main parlor, positioning them around the dinner table like they were having a family meal. But this time, we left more than just our symbol. This time, we left a message. Using Jonathan Hartwell's blood, We wrote on the white wall above the fireplace, "The children of the hanged man send their regards." Then we disappeared into the night, slipping away through the cotton fields while the party continued downstairs. The guests too drunk and distracted to realize that their hosts had been murdered above their heads. The bodies weren't discovered until the next morning, when the servants came to clean up after the party. The screaming could be heard for miles, and within hours, every plantation in the parish was buzzing with rumors and theories. Some said it was the work of abolitionists from the north. Others blamed runaway slaves or swamp bandits. A few whispered about voodoo curses and angry spirits seeking revenge. But no one suspected the two quiet slave girls who had been working in the fields all night, their hands stained with cotton instead of blood. Master Beauregard called another meeting with the sheriff and the neighboring plantation owners. They talked about increasing security, about bringing in more dogs and armed guards, about the need to crack down harder on the slave population to prevent any ideas about rebellion. But we weren't rebels in the traditional sense. We weren't trying to free anyone or change the system. We were something much more dangerous. We were the system's own children, raised in its violence, shaped by its cruelty, and now turned back against it like a weapon forged in its own fires. That night, as we lay in our beds listening to the other slaves whisper about the murders, Morel rolled over and looked at me with eyes that reflected the moonlight like still water. "They're starting to understand," she said quietly. "Understand what?" I asked. "That we're not just killing people," she replied. "We're killing the idea that they're safe. We're killing their certainty that they can do whatever they want to us without consequences." She was right. The fear was spreading like wildfire through the white community, changing the way they looked at their slaves, the way they moved through their own homes. They were beginning to realize that their victims might not always remain victims, and we were just getting started. The cotton fields whispered our names to the wind, and in the distance storm clouds gathered on the horizon like an army preparing for war. The murders of the Webb and Hartwell families had transformed the entire parish into a powder keg of fear and suspicion. White folks who had once moved through their plantations with absolute confidence now jumped at shadows and slept with loaded pistols under their pillows. The slave quarters buzzed with whispered conversations about justice and revenge, and I could see something new in the eyes of my people, hope. But Morel and I weren't finished. We had two more families on our list, two more sets of people who had participated in Papa's death and Mama's suffering. The Beaumont family, who owned the largest plantation in the parish, and the Rousseau family, who supplied the rope that had been used to hang Papa. The Beaumonts were old Louisiana aristocracy, their wealth built on 3 generations of slave labor and cotton profits. Henry Beaumont was a thin, elegant man who prided himself on his refined cruelty. He never raised his voice or lost his temper, but his punishments were legendary for their creativity and lasting damage. His wife Celeste was a former belle from New Orleans who had brought her own special brand of sadism to the plantation. They had 4 children, ranging in age from 8 to 22, and each one had been carefully trained in the art of viewing slaves as less than human. The eldest son, Philippe, was already managing his own section of the plantation and had developed a reputation for working slaves to death during harvest season. The Rousseau family was different. They were merchants rather than plantation owners, but they supplied rope, chains, and other tools of oppression to every plantation in the parish. Claude Rousseau had personally delivered the rope used to hang Papa and had stayed to watch the execution like it was entertainment. We decided to take both families on the same night. During the new moon, when the darkness would provide perfect cover, it would be our most ambitious operation yet, requiring precise timing and flawless execution. The Beaumont plantation was heavily guarded, but we had been studying their security for months. The guards made their rounds every 2 hours, and there was a 15-minute window when the back of the house was completely unprotected. We would have to move fast and strike without hesitation. We started with the Rousseau family, who lived in a modest house in town above their rope and chain shop. Claude Rousseau was a widower who lived alone with his elderly mother and his teenage nephew, making our job significantly easier. We entered through the shop, using tools we had stolen from the plantation's blacksmith to pick the lock on the back door. The smell of hemp and metal filled the air, along with something else, the lingering scent of fear and desperation that seemed to cling to everything these people touched. Claude Rousseau died in his sleep, never knowing what hit him. His mother lasted long enough to see my face in the lamplight, and I made sure she understood exactly why she was dying before Morel's knife found her heart. The nephew tried to run, but there was nowhere to go in the small house, and his screams were muffled by the thick walls that had been built to contain other people's suffering. We left our symbol carved into the wooden counter of the rope shop, along with a length of the same rope that had been used to hang Papa. Then we disappeared into the night, making our way across town to the Beaumont plantation. The mansion sat on a hill overlooking the river, its white columns gleaming in the starlight like the bones of some ancient beast. We approached from the riverside, where the cypress trees provided cover and the guards rarely patrolled. Getting inside was more challenging than we had anticipated. The Beaumonts had increased their security after the previous murders, and we had to wait nearly an hour for the right opportunity. But patience had always been our greatest weapon, and eventually the guards moved to their next position, leaving us a narrow window of opportunity. We entered through the conservatory, where Celeste Beaumont grew her prized orchids in a glass room that stayed warm even in winter. The flowers seemed to watch us as we moved through their midst, their exotic blooms like eyes in the darkness. Henri Beaumont was in his study, working late on plantation accounts by lamplight. He looked up when we entered, and for a moment his face showed nothing but mild curiosity, as if he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. "You're Samuel's daughters," he said finally, his voice calm and measured. "I remember you from the day your father died." "Good," I replied, stepping closer to his desk. "Then you know why we're here." He reached for the pistol in his desk drawer, but Morel was faster. Her knife caught him in the wrist, and the gun clattered to the floor as he screamed in pain and shock. "Your father was a thief," he gasped, clutching his wounded hand. "He stole food that belonged to me." "He was trying to feed his children," Morel said, her voice cold as winter wind. "Something you would never understand." We took our time with Henri Beaumont, making sure he felt every moment of his death, making sure he understood that this was justice for every slave he had tortured, every family he had destroyed, every life he had stolen for his own profit. Celeste Beaumont died in her bedroom, surrounded by the silk dresses and jewelry she had bought with blood money. She begged for her life, promised us freedom and gold if we would spare her. But we had learned long ago that the promises of white folks were worth less than the cotton we picked. The children were scattered throughout the house, and we hunted them methodically, room by room, like wolves culling a herd. Felipe, the eldest, tried to fight back with a sword he had inherited from his grandfather, but years of soft living had made him weak, and the blade felt clumsy in his pampered hands. The youngest, a girl of 8, was the hardest to kill. Not because she was innocent, we had seen her throw rocks at slave children and laugh when they cried, but because she reminded me of what Morel and I had been at that age, before the world had shown us its true face. But mercy was a luxury we couldn't afford, and innocence was a concept that had died with Papa on that magnolia tree. When it was over, we arranged the bodies in the grand ballroom, positioning them around the piano where Celeste had once entertained guests with songs about the romance of the Old South. We wrote our message on the wall in Henri's blood: "The rope you sold has come home." Then we walked out the front door like we owned the place, disappearing into the cotton fields as the first light of dawn began to creep across the horizon. By the time the bodies were discovered, we were back in our cabin, sleeping peacefully while the white world erupted in panic and terror around us. 4 families dead, dozens of lives ended. And still, no one suspected the two quiet slave girls who had been picking cotton in the fields, their hands stained with plant matter instead of blood. But the fear was spreading now, changing everything. White folks were leaving the parish, selling their plantations and fleeing to safer places. Those who remained lived like prisoners in their own homes, afraid to sleep, afraid to trust anyone, afraid of the shadows that might hide their judgment. The system that had created us was beginning to eat itself alive, and we were just getting started. The deaths of 4 prominent families in less than 2 months had transformed our parish from a bastion of southern gentility into a war zone of fear and paranoia. White folks who had once strutted around their plantations like kings now moved in armed groups, their eyes constantly scanning the shadows for threats they couldn't name or understand. Master Beauregard had tripled the guards around our plantation and brought in a pack of bloodhounds trained to track runaway slaves. But what he really wanted was something much more dangerous. He wanted professional killers, men who specialized in hunting human prey. The bounty hunters arrived on a Tuesday morning when the air was thick with the promise of rain, and the cotton fields stretched endlessly under a gray sky that seemed to press down on everything like a burial shroud. There were 5 of them, hard men with cold eyes and hands that never strayed far from their weapons. Their leader was a tall, lean man named Jeremiah Cross, who wore a black coat despite the heat and carried a rifle that looked like it had seen more death than a battlefield surgeon. He had a reputation throughout the South for tracking down runaway slaves and bringing them back dead or alive, usually dead, since corpses couldn't run away again. The others were cut from the same cloth. Marcus Stone, a former soldier who had lost his taste for legitimate warfare. Billy Tate, a young man with dead eyes who killed for the pure joy of it. Samuel Wright, an ex-overseer who had been fired for excessive brutality. And Thomas Kane, a tracker who could follow a trail through swampland that would confuse a Choctaw brave. They set up camp in the old tobacco barn, turning it into a fortress with gun ports and clear sightlines in every direction. Master Beauregard gave them free rein to question any slave they wanted, to search any cabin, to use whatever methods they deemed necessary to find the killers. But Morel and I had been preparing for this moment since the night we killed the Webb family. We knew that eventually someone would come looking for us, someone more dangerous than the local sheriff or the bumbling plantation guards. We had spent months studying the swampland that bordered the plantation, learning its secrets, mapping its hidden paths and treacherous waters. The Atchafalaya swamp was a maze of cypress trees and Spanish moss, of hidden channels and floating islands that appeared and disappeared with the changing water levels. It was a place where even experienced hunters could get lost and never find their way out, where alligators and water moccasins ruled territories older than human memory. Most importantly, it was a place where the rules of the white world didn't apply, where a person could disappear completely and emerge somewhere else entirely, transformed by the ancient magic that still lingered in the dark water and twisted trees. The bounty hunters started their investigation by questioning the other slaves, using methods that would have made the Spanish Inquisition proud. They hung old Samuel from his thumbs until he passed out, then revived him with cold water and started again. They whipped young Mary until her back looked like raw meat, demanding to know what she had seen on the nights of the murders. But the slave quarters had closed ranks around us, even though most of them didn't know we were the killers they were protecting. They had learned long ago that cooperating with white authority only brought more pain, and they would rather die than betray their own people to these monsters. Jeremiah Cross grew frustrated with the lack of progress, and his methods became increasingly brutal. He started taking slaves into the swamp and leaving their bodies where the others would find them, hoping that fear would loosen tongues and break the wall of silence that protected us. But he had made a crucial mistake. He had entered our territory, the place where we held every advantage, and he was just another lost soul stumbling through the darkness. We struck on the third night of their hunt, when Thomas Kane was tracking what he thought was our trail through the deepest part of the swamp. He was good at his job, following signs that most men would never notice, but he was tracking ghosts and shadows, following a path we had laid for him like breadcrumbs, leading to a gingerbread house. The water was chest deep when we took him, rising up from the black surface like spirits of the drowned. He never had a chance to scream, never had a chance to reach for his weapons. One moment, he was studying broken twigs and disturbed moss. The next, he was sinking beneath the surface, with Mirel's knife between his ribs. We left his body floating face down in a clearing where the others would find it, but not before we had taken his scalp and carved our symbol into his forehead. Let them know that the hunters had become the hunted, that their prey was more dangerous than they had imagined. Billy Tate was next, taken while he was relieving himself behind a cypress tree that was older than the plantation itself. We hung him from the Spanish moss like a grotesque Christmas ornament, his body swaying in the humid breeze while the alligators gathered below, drawn by the scent of blood. Samuel Wright lasted longer than the others, managing to wound Morel with a lucky shot from his pistol before I opened his throat with the knife we had taken from the plantation's kitchen. But his death was messier than we preferred, and we had to work quickly to arrange his body before the others came looking for him. Marcus Stone was the smartest of the group, smart enough to realize that they were being systematically eliminated by an enemy who knew the swamp better than they knew their own names. He tried to convince Jeremiah Cross to retreat, to call for reinforcements, to admit that they were outmatched. But Cross was too proud and too greedy to give up. The bounty on our heads had grown to $1,000 each, enough money to buy a small plantation, and he could taste the wealth that would come with our capture. He made his final mistake on the 7th night, when he decided to hunt us alone, convinced that his superior skills and experience would be enough to overcome 2 slave girls who had gotten lucky against his less capable partners. We found him at dawn, sitting with his back against a cypress tree, his rifle across his knees, his eyes scanning the water for any sign of movement. He looked like a statue carved from stone, patient and deadly, and absolutely certain of his own invincibility. But statues don't bleed, and Jeremiah Cross discovered that fact when Morel's arrow punched through his chest from behind, pinning him to the tree like a butterfly in a collector's case. He lived long enough to see us emerge from the water, long enough to understand that he had been outmatched from the very beginning. Long enough to realize that the monsters he had been hunting were far more dangerous than anything he had ever faced. "Who are you?" he whispered, blood frothing from his lips. "We're the daughters of the man you came to avenge," I replied, kneeling beside him as his life drained away. "We're the children of your nightmares." When it was over, we arranged the bodies of all 5 bounty hunters in a circle around their camp, positioning them like they were having a final meeting in hell. We left our symbol carved into the barn door, along with a message written in Jeremiah Cross's blood: "The swamp remembers everything." Then we disappeared back into the dark water, leaving no trail for anyone else to follow, becoming one with the ancient spirits that had always ruled this place. The discovery of the bounty hunters' bodies sent shockwaves through the entire South. These were men who had never failed to bring back their prey, men who were feared from Virginia to Texas, and they had been slaughtered like sheep by an enemy that remained invisible and untouchable. Master Beauregard stopped bringing in outside help after that. The message was clear. Anyone who came hunting for us would join the growing collection of bodies that marked our territory. The swamp had claimed its tribute, and we were its most faithful servants. The massacre of the bounty hunters had pushed Master Beauregard and the remaining plantation owners past the breaking point of rational thought. Fear had transformed them into something desperate and dangerous, like cornered animals who would rather destroy everything than admit defeat. 3 weeks after we left Jeremiah Cross and his men feeding the alligators in the swamp, Beauregard called a meeting of every white man in the parish who could hold a gun. They gathered in the main house like generals planning a war, their voices carrying across the plantation grounds as they debated the best way to root out what they called the cancer that was destroying their way of life. I watched from the cotton fields as carriages and horses arrived throughout the day, bringing plantation owners, overseers, merchants, and even the sheriff from town. By evening, there were nearly 50 armed white men crowded into Beauregard's parlor, drinking his whiskey and working themselves into a frenzy of righteous anger. The plan they hatched was as brutal as it was simple. They would surround the slave quarters and demand that we be turned over to them. If the slaves refused to cooperate, they would burn the entire quarters to the ground and shoot anyone who tried to escape. They were convinced that the other slaves were protecting us, hiding us, helping us plan our attacks. They weren't entirely wrong. While most of the slaves didn't know that Morel and I were the killers they sought, they had closed ranks around us instinctively, the way prey animals protect their young from predators. They had learned long ago that survival meant solidarity, that betraying one of their own to white authority was a sin that could never be forgiven. But what the white men didn't understand was that their plan would accomplish exactly the opposite of what they intended. Instead of isolating us, they were about to turn every slave on the plantation into our allies, transforming a secret war into an open rebellion. The siege began at dawn on a Sunday morning, when the mist still clung to the ground like the ghosts of all the slaves who had died on this cursed land. The white men surrounded the quarters with military precision, positioning themselves behind cotton bales and farm equipment, their rifles trained on the small cabins where nearly 200 slaves lived in conditions that would shame a dog kennel. Master Beauregard stepped forward with a white flag tied to a stick, playing at being a civilized man even as he prepared to commit mass murder. "You all know why we're here," he called out, his voice carrying across the silent quarters. "We want the 2 women who have been killing white families. Turn them over to us, and the rest of you will be spared." The silence that followed was deafening. Not a single door opened. Not a single voice responded to his demand. The slaves had made their choice, and it wasn't the choice the white men had expected. Old Samuel, who had somehow survived the bounty hunter's interrogation despite being beaten nearly to death, finally emerged from his cabin. He walked slowly toward the line of armed men, his back straight despite his age and injuries, his dignity intact despite everything they had done to break him. "Master Beauregard," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 70 years of suffering, "we don't know nothing about no killers. We just slaves trying to survive another day in this hell you created." "Don't lie to me, old man," Beauregard snarled, his civilized mask slipping to reveal the monster beneath. "Those women are hiding among you, and you're protecting them. I'll give you one more chance to do the right thing." Samuel looked around at the faces of his people, at the children peeking out from behind their mothers' skirts, at the young men whose hands were already moving toward the farm tools that could serve as weapons if necessary. "The right thing?" he repeated, and for the first time in decades he smiled. "Master, I think we got different ideas about what's right." That's when Beauregard gave the order to open fire. The first volley shattered the morning air like thunder, sending splinters flying from the cabin walls and driving the slaves back into whatever cover they could find. But instead of cowering in terror as the white men had expected, something extraordinary happened. The slaves fought back. They emerged from their cabins with axes and hammers, with kitchen knives and pitchforks, with anything that could be used as a weapon. They had spent their entire lives being beaten and brutalized, and they had finally reached the point where death in battle seemed preferable to continued slavery. Young Marcus, who worked in the blacksmith shop, had been preparing for this moment for weeks. He emerged from his cabin carrying a bag full of horseshoes that he hurled at the white men with deadly accuracy, each one finding its target with a satisfying crack of bone. The women joined the fight too, throwing boiling water from their cooking pots and wielding cast iron skillets like medieval maces. Even the children contributed, darting between the cabins to carry ammunition and messages, their small size making them nearly impossible targets. But the white men had superior weapons and training, and slowly they began to push the slaves back toward the center of the quarters. Bodies fell on both sides, but for every white man who died, 3 slaves joined him in death. That's when Morel and I made our entrance. We came from the direction of the swamp, where we had been hiding since before dawn, waiting for exactly this moment. We moved like shadows given form, like death itself walking among the living, and the white men's attention turned to us like iron filings drawn to a magnet. "There!" Beauregard screamed, pointing at us with a shaking finger. "There are your killers. Take them alive if you can, but take them." The battle that followed was unlike anything that had ever been seen on a Louisiana plantation. We moved through the chaos like dancers performing a deadly ballet, our knives finding targets with surgical precision, while the slaves rallied around us with renewed courage. I put my blade through the heart of Thomas Crenshaw, the overseer who had replaced Marcus Webb, watching his eyes go wide with shock as he realized that his victims had finally learned to bite back. Morel took down 2 of the neighboring plantation owners with throws that would have impressed a circus performer, her knives spinning through the air like deadly birds. But we were outnumbered and outgunned, and eventually the weight of numbers began to tell. A rifle bullet caught me in the shoulder, spinning me around and sending me crashing into the side of a cabin. Another grazed Morel's temple, leaving a line of blood that made her look like a war goddess from some ancient mythology. The slaves were falling too, their courage no match for superior firepower. Old Samuel went down with 3 bullets in his chest, still swinging his hammer at the men who had tormented him for 7 decades. Young Marcus died trying to shield a group of children, his body riddled with holes, but his spirit unbroken. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, it became clear that this would be our last battle. We were trapped in the center of the quarters, surrounded by dead and dying slaves, facing an enemy that had us outnumbered 10-1. But we had accomplished something that no amount of killing could undo. We had shown the slaves that their oppressors could bleed, could die, could be made to pay for their cruelty. We had planted a seed of rebellion that would grow long after our bodies had fed the Louisiana soil. Master Beauregard approached us slowly, his rifle trained on my chest, his face flushed with victory and bloodlust. "It's over," he said, breathing hard from the battle. "You've caused enough trouble for one lifetime." I looked around at the carnage we had created, at the bodies of slaves and masters lying together in death, and I smiled. "No," I replied, feeling the ice in my chest pulse with cold fire one last time. "It's just beginning." The cotton fields whispered our names to the wind, and somewhere in the distance, storm clouds gathered on the horizon like an army of the dead preparing for one final charge. The siege of the slave quarters had ended with our capture, but not our defeat. As Master Beauregard and his surviving men dragged us toward the main house, I could see something in the eyes of the slaves who had lived through the battle. A spark that hadn't been there before. A flame that no amount of brutality could extinguish. They had seen their oppressors bleed. They had seen white men die by black hands. They had tasted the possibility of freedom, even if it had come at a terrible cost. Beauregard locked us in the root cellar beneath the main house, a damp, dark space that smelled of rotting vegetables and despair. Our hands were bound with the same rope that had been used to hang Papa, a detail that I'm sure he thought was poetic justice. But what he didn't know was that we had been preparing for this moment since the night we killed the Webb family. Hidden in the seams of our dresses were small vials of lamp oil that we had been stealing and saving for months. Sewn into the hem of Morel's skirt was a piece of flint and steel that we had taken from the plantation's blacksmith shop. We had always known that our war would end in fire. As night fell and the plantation settled into an uneasy quiet, we began our final preparations. The root cellar was directly beneath the main house's kitchen, and the wooden floor above our heads was old and dry, seasoned by decades of Louisiana heat and humidity. "Are you ready?" Morel whispered, her voice barely audible in the darkness. I thought about Papa hanging from the magnolia tree, about Mama dying of a broken heart, about all the slaves who had suffered and died on this cursed land. I thought about the children who would grow up in chains if we failed, and the children who might grow up free if we succeeded. "I've been ready since I was 12 years old," I replied. We worked in silence, using our teeth to tear open the hidden vials and spread the lamp oil across the wooden ceiling above us. The smell was sharp and acrid, mixing with the musty air of the cellar to create an atmosphere that seemed charged with possibility. When the oil was in place, Morel struck the flint against the steel, sending sparks dancing through the darkness like fireflies. It took several tries, but eventually one of the sparks caught, and a small flame began to lick at the oil-soaked wood. The fire spread slowly at first, then with increasing hunger as it found more fuel in the ancient timbers of the house. We could hear it crackling above our heads, could feel the heat beginning to build in our underground prison, but we weren't planning to die in that cellar. We had one more surprise for Master Beauregard and his men. The root cellar had been built during the early days of the plantation, when Indian raids were still a concern. It connected to a network of tunnels that led to the river, escape routes that the original owners had constructed but never used. We had discovered them months ago during our nighttime explorations, and we had been preparing them for exactly this moment. As the fire spread through the main house above us, we made our way through the narrow tunnels, crawling through spaces barely wide enough for our bodies, following a path that led away from the plantation and toward the dark waters of the Atchafalaya. Behind us, we could hear the screams beginning as the house erupted in flames. Master Beauregard and his family were trapped on the upper floors, cut off from escape by the inferno that was consuming their home. The same fire that had been used to brand slaves, to heat the irons that scarred our people, was now claiming the lives of their oppressors. We emerged from the tunnels at the river's edge, where a small boat waited in the reeds. We had stolen it weeks ago and hidden it here, along with supplies for our final journey into the swamp. As we pushed off from the shore, we could see the plantation burning behind us, the flames reaching toward the sky like the prayers of all the slaves who had died in bondage. The main house was completely engulfed now, its white columns cracking and falling as the fire consumed everything that had once represented southern gentility and grace. The slave quarters were burning too, but those fires had been set by the surviving slaves themselves, who had decided that they would rather destroy everything than continue living in chains. We could see figures running through the smoke and flames, some trying to fight the fires, others simply trying to escape. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from the judgment that had finally come to claim them. As our boat drifted into the deeper channels of the swamp, we heard the sound of gunshots echoing across the water. The slaves were fighting back, using weapons they had taken from the dead white men, turning the plantation into a battlefield where the old rules no longer applied. Some would die in the fighting, but others would escape into the swamp, following paths that we had shown them during our years of preparation. They would carry our story with them, spreading the word that resistance was possible, that the system could be fought and defeated. The fire burned for 3 days, consuming not just the main house, but most of the outbuildings and a significant portion of the cotton crop. When it was finally extinguished, there was nothing left but charred ruins and the blackened stumps of the magnolia trees where Papa had died. Master Beauregard's body was found in his study, burned beyond recognition, but still clutching the whip he had used to torture so many slaves. His family had died with him, trapped by the flames that had started in the cellar where they thought they had imprisoned us. The authorities searched for us for months, sending tracking parties into the swamp, offering rewards for information about our whereabouts. But the Atchafalaya had swallowed us completely, making us part of its ancient mysteries, its timeless secrets. Some say we died in the swamp, consumed by the same violence that had created us. Others claim we escaped to the north, where we lived out our days in freedom. A few whisper that we're still out there, moving through the dark waters like spirits of vengeance, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The truth is simpler and more complex than any of those stories. We became what we had always been destined to become. Legends, symbols, reminders that even the most oppressed people can find the strength to fight back when pushed beyond their breaking point. The plantation system continued for another 20 years after our war ended, but it was never the same. The fear we had planted grew and spread, changing the way masters treated their slaves, changing the way slaves saw themselves and their possibilities. When the Civil War finally came, many of the slaves who fought for their freedom carried our story with them into battle. They remembered the two sisters who had shown them that their oppressors could bleed, could die, could be made to pay for their cruelty. And in the deep swamps of Louisiana, where the cypress trees grow tall and the Spanish moss hangs like curtains between the worlds of the living and the dead, our spirits still whisper to those who have the courage to listen. We are the daughters of the hanged man, the children of a system that created its own destruction. We are the proof that some fires once lit can never be extinguished. The cotton fields remember our names, and the wind carries our story to anyone brave enough to hear it. The legend of Zara and Mirel spread throughout the South in the years following the burning of the Beauregard plantation. Some called them monsters, others called them heroes, but everyone agreed that they had changed something fundamental about the relationship between master and slave. Their story became a whispered reminder that oppression always carries the seeds of its own destruction, and that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones created by the system itself. To this day, in the deep swamps of Louisiana, locals claim you can still see two figures moving through the mist on moonless nights, forever hunting those who would enslave and brutalize the innocent. Whether they are ghosts or legends or something else entirely, their message remains the same. Justice may be delayed, but it will never be denied.